Dumbass, you should have read the fine print. Aaron said it into the microphone like he was delivering the punchline of the year. Like he had been waiting months to say it out loud in a room full of people who would applaud. 87 shareholders were watching. Cameras were rolling. Board members were sitting in the front row with their polished shoes, folded hands, and those practiced smiles that never quite reached the eyes. And my boss had just fired me on a stage in front of all of them. Like I was some outdated piece of office equipment he was finally getting around to throwing away. I did not shout. I did not storm the stage. I did not even stand up at first. I just looked at him from 7 rows back, calm enough for the whole ballroom to hear, and said, "Before I go, could you ask Ray to read Clause 6D of my employment agreement into the record?" That was the moment Aaron's smile started dying. And that was the moment a $40 million company began disappearing in front of everyone who had come to watch my career end. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe to Alex's Revenge Justice. Because stories like this are not just about revenge. They are about patience, proof, and the moment arrogant people realize they picked the wrong person to humiliate. My name is Greg Thompson. I am 47 years old, and I have been writing code since before half the people in that ballroom knew what a modem sounded like. This did not happen overnight. It started quietly months before that stage, with missed meeting invites and locked dashboards and a younger executive who thought modern leadership meant erasing the man who built the system he was busy selling. The ballroom smelled like burnt coffee and polished leather and the specific kind of nervous money that collects in a room when investors have flown in for good news and are not entirely sure they are getting it. Reporters waited near the back wall. Board members checked their phones. Shareholders sat in neat rows with their name badges and their expectations, waiting for the company to tell them how bright the future looked. I had chosen my seat carefully. 7th row, center section. Clear line of sight to the stage. Clear path to the exit when the time came. I was not sitting there as some aging employee waiting to be told his time had passed. I was sitting there as the man who had spent 6 years building the hospital systems this company sold as its crown jewel. The Technology 3 medical centers depended on every single day to keep patient data flowing, to keep pharmacy orders processing, to keep emergency room dashboards telling doctors what they needed to know before it was too late to act on it. When you have spent more than 2 decades inside corporate rooms, you learn things that nobody puts in a job description. You learn that where you sit matters. You learn which executives avoid eye contact when they already know someone is about to be sacrificed. You learn how to read the air in a room before anyone opens their mouth. Aaron Bradley walked onto the stage at exactly 9:15. 32 years old, expensive MBA, rolled sleeves and a loosened tie, and that particular artificial confidence that young executives wear when they want everyone in the room to believe they are not just managing a business, they are changing the world. He started clicking through slides, market projections, partnership announcements. A section called Strategic Leadership Evolution that used phrases like organizational optimization and future-ready infrastructure in almost every other sentence. That was corporate language for removing people who made younger executives feel unnecessary. Then he said the phrase he loved most, next generation thinking. I almost smiled. Because the old thinking he was so eager to discard was the same architecture keeping 3 hospitals operational every single day. The same code that had never failed a compliance audit. The same systems that had kept patient records intact during a network outage at 2 in the morning while Aaron was asleep and I was on an escalation call with a hospital administrator who needed answers in real time. Those systems did not run on slogans. They ran on careful decisions made over thousands of hours, on documentation written at the kind of unglamorous hours nobody includes in a shareholder presentation, on architecture that had been tested not by a demo environment, but by actual hospitals with actual patients who could not afford for anything to stop working. But to Aaron, all of that was just legacy debt. And I was the old engineer standing in the way of his story. Aaron had a talent for making cruelty sound like strategy. He never said we are pushing Greg out. He said we need to align leadership with our growth trajectory. He never said the old guy makes me look unnecessary. He said we need fresh energy around the platform. That was how it started. Not with a termination notice. Not with HR calling me into a glass conference room for a conversation I had seen coming. Just small removals, one after another. Quiet enough that anyone watching from the outside could pretend nothing was happening. First, I was left off the Monday architecture review. The same meeting I had created. The same meeting I had run for 4 years. I refreshed my inbox twice that first Monday morning, assuming it was a scheduling error. But the invite did not appear. When I asked Aaron about it, he gave me the polished executive smile that I was starting to understand meant the opposite of reassurance. We're just streamlining the process, Greg. Getting more stakeholders involved. Stakeholders. That was his word for people who had never debugged a hospital system at 3 in the morning. People who had never sat on a compliance call explaining why data was still safe even when half the network was struggling. People who could say the word architecture in a meeting without being able to explain what made one design stronger than another. Then it happened again. Another meeting. Another missing invite. Another decision made in a room where my name used to be on the agenda. My access to the investor dashboard expired 3 weeks later, 6 years without a problem, and suddenly my permissions were under review. Aaron said IT would fix it. IT never did. Client demos started happening without me. My diagrams were cleaned up, recolored, and dropped into Aaron's presentation decks with no attribution. My technical notes became his talking points. My architecture became the company's new innovation roadmap. Nobody announced that I was being erased. They just removed me one room at a time. And then came Tyler Nash. Aaron introduced him on a Tuesday morning like he had personally discovered the future and brought it into the conference room wearing clean sneakers. Greg, you're going to love working with Tyler, he said, clapping the kid on the shoulder. He brings fresh thinking to the team. Tyler was 26, polite, nervous, eager to prove himself. He had a computer science degree and the kind of enthusiasm that had not yet been worn down by a production outage or a compliance audit or the particular loneliness of being the only person who understands why something was built the way it was. I did not dislike him. That was the complicated part. Tyler was not trying to steal anything. He was trying to survive the opportunity Aaron had handed him. He asked good questions. He took careful notes. He worked hard, and some part of him seemed to sense that the position he had been given was more complicated than it appeared. But Aaron was not mentoring him. He was using him. Within 2 weeks, Tyler was sitting in client demos I had been removed from. Within a month, he was explaining architecture he had only seen in diagrams. Within 2 months, Aaron was calling him the face of the company's modernization effort. The face. Not the builder, not the designer, not the person who had made the decisions that kept those systems running through 3 compliance cycles and 2 major hospital expansions. Just the younger face placed in front of older work. In one team meeting, Tyler used a phrase that stuck with me. He called the anomaly detection system the error vacuum, joking that it seemed to swallow problems before anyone noticed them. The room laughed. Aaron laughed the loudest. I kept my expression neutral and said nothing. That system had taken me 8 months to build. It monitored data flows across hospital intake pipelines and identified degradation patterns before they became failures. It was not a background tool. It was the difference between a hospital catching a problem before patients were affected and discovering the problem after the damage was done. But if Aaron could reduce it to a punchline, he could reduce me to a relic. That was the strategy. Not to replace the work. They could not replace the work quickly enough to matter. Replace the story of who built it. And the moment I understood that, I stopped defending myself. That is something experience teaches you that no MBA program ever will. When someone is already constructing a false narrative, arguing against it too early only gives them material to work with. Every protest becomes evidence of your insecurity. Every correction becomes proof that you are resistant to change. So I did what engineers do. I documented. Not just the code, everything around it. Every commit with my username in the history, every architecture document with my initials in the revision log. Every design diagram I had created before Aaron could spell half the technical terms he was now using in investor calls. Every patent filing where my name appeared in the first position. Every email thread showing that I had designed the data pipelines, the failover logic, the pharmacy integration layer, and the hospital compliance framework that Aaron's team was now presenting as their bold new vision. I saved screenshots of dashboard permissions before they quietly disappeared. I exported old performance reviews where Aaron had praised the same systems he was now calling traditional frameworks. I archived client questions I had answered directly, technical problems I had solved, escalation calls I had led. Nothing hidden, nothing dramatic, nothing that required me to do anything dishonest. Just proof. Clean, boring, time-stamped proof that did not care who was popular or who sounded more impressive in front of investors. Lisa watched me most evenings, sitting at the kitchen table with a coffee that kept going cold while I sorted files into folders. "You're really preparing for something," she said one night. I looked up at her. "I'm preparing for the truth to need evidence." She set her mug down and looked at me for a long moment. "How bad is it going to get before it gets better?" I thought about that. Bad enough that he'll do something he can't take back. She nodded slowly and did not ask me to explain further. After 23 years of marriage, she had learned to read the difference between me worrying and me being ready. I was ready. But the documentation was only half of it. The other half had been sitting quietly in my employment contract since 2019. During a company restructuring that year, everyone was panicking over stock options. Revised contracts were flying through HR faster than anyone could review them. People were signing because they wanted their options repriced and their jobs secured, and nobody wanted to be the person who slowed things down by asking too many questions. I slowed things down. I sat in Ray Martinez's office with the employment agreement open in front of me and asked a question that made him tilt his head like I had said something in a different language. What happens to intellectual property if someone is terminated without cause? Ray gave me the standard answer. Company keeps everything created during employment. So I asked another question. What if that language changed before I signed? He looked at me for a long moment. That would need board approval. Then let's get it. The clause I proposed was simple. If I was ever terminated without cause, any intellectual property I had authored, designed, or materially contributed to would revert back to me. Source code, architecture documents, technical specifications, system designs, all of it. Unusual? Yes. Illegal? No. And during a restructuring when the board was approving 22 revised contracts in a single afternoon, Mine passed through with everything else. Clause 6D. 4 paragraphs buried in Section 4 of my employment agreement, signed, countersigned, and board approved. 22 people signed that day for better stock terms. I signed for insurance. For 5 years, that clause did nothing. That was exactly how I wanted it. As long as the company kept me on payroll, as long as they did not terminate me without cause, the system stayed in place. The code kept running. The hospitals stayed connected. Investors kept hearing projections about growth and scalability and Aaron's next-generation vision. Everybody won. All Aaron had to do was not fire me publicly without a legally valid reason. That was it. He could have negotiated a quiet transition, a consulting arrangement, a graceful handoff. I would have accepted almost anything that let the hospitals keep running while the company figured out how to stand on its own. But Aaron did not want quiet. He wanted a moment. He wanted 87 shareholders and a room full of cameras to watch him prove that the company had outgrown the old engineer who had built its foundation. He wanted the headline, the applause, and the story of a bold young leader clearing away the past to make room for the future. So he put my name on a slide. He called my systems traditional frameworks. He framed my removal as evolution. And then, with a room full of witnesses, he terminated me without cause. The second those words left his mouth, Clause 6D was no longer buried paperwork. It was active ownership. Everything I had authored, designed, documented, or materially contributed to was no longer under the company's control by default. The hospital management systems, the anomaly detection protocols, the data pipeline architecture, the failover logic, the compliance framework, the documentation explaining how all of it held together. Aaron thought he was cutting me out of the company. What he actually did was cut the company away from me. When I asked Ray to read the clause into the record, I watched something happen to Aaron's face that I had never seen before. He had always had an answer. In 3 years of watching him work, I had never seen him caught without a prepared response. He was too controlled for that, too accustomed to shaping rooms to his advantage. But standing on that stage with 87 shareholders watching and cameras recording, Aaron Bradley had absolutely nothing to say. His hand tightened around the microphone. His smile went rigid. He looked down at Ray in the front row with the expression of a man hoping his lawyer could somehow make a legally binding contract disappear. Ray opened his laptop. I watched him search, then search again. Then the color started leaving his face in a way that had nothing to do with the ballroom lighting. He cleared his throat and read, "Upon termination without cause, all intellectual property authored, designed, or materially contributed to by the employee shall revert to said employee, including source code, system architecture, technical specifications, and related documentation." The room went very quiet. Then someone near the aisle asked, just above a whisper, "Is that enforceable?" Ray looked at the document in his hands, not at Aaron, not at the board. "It is signed, countersigned, and board approved." That sentence landed harder than anything I could have said. Aaron tried to recover. He called it boilerplate language, a legal formality that had no practical meaning. His voice had the slight flatness of someone improvising in a situation they had not prepared for. But Ray shook his head and kept reading. Principal architect on the core hospital systems, lead inventor on 4 patent applications, primary author of the technical specifications defining the platform architecture. Every line pulled another brick from the wall Aaron had spent 3 years building around himself. By the time Ray finished, the room understood the situation clearly. They had not just fired an employee. They had fired the man who owned the foundation. I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. That was the moment nobody expected. They thought the problem was theoretical, a legal dispute that lawyers could argue about in conference rooms for months while the company kept operating. Something that would take time to untangle. But ownership is not theoretical when the product depends on your keys. I had prepared the access revocation weeks earlier, not in anger, not as a threat I was waiting to use, as documentation of what would happen if the clause was triggered. I opened the application. No countdown, no speech, just a clean screen and one confirmation button. The hospital management platform, the data pipelines, the anomaly detection protocols, the failover architecture. Every access token and authentication credential tied to systems I had authored or materially contributed to. I tapped the button. 30 seconds. The screens behind Aaron flickered once, then again. His presentation disappeared mid-slide, replaced by dashboards showing red across every connected service. Critical systems offline, data flows terminated, authentication required. A sound moved through the ballroom that was not quite a gasp. More like 87 people realizing simultaneously that the floor they were standing on had never belonged to the company. Victor, our CTO, was typing before the screens finished changing. Then he looked up from his laptop with an expression I had never seen on him before. "We're locked out," he said. "Every client integration is throwing authentication errors." Aaron found his voice. "This is sabotage," Ray answered before I could say a word. "No, this is intellectual property protection. Greg owns the systems. He has the legal right to control access." That was when the meeting stopped being a shareholder presentation. It became a rescue operation. Board members abandoned their seats. Investors moved toward the exits with their phones already to their ears. Reporters were taking notes faster than before, because the story had become significantly better than anything they had expected walking in that morning. Aaron kept repeating the same word, sabotage. He said it to Ray. He said it to Victor. He said it into the microphone even though nobody was listening to the microphone anymore. He said it like repetition could make a signed contract disappear. But Ray would not give him that exit. "This is not sabotage," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear clearly. "Greg is protecting intellectual property he legally owns." An investor near the center aisle turned and looked directly at me. "How much?" I walked toward the front slowly. I had rehearsed nothing. I did not need to. This was just math. "For immediate restoration while permanent licensing terms are negotiated," I said, $200,000 per month, paid in advance, 3-month minimum to start. Someone in the back laughed, but there was panic underneath it. "That's extortion." I looked at Aaron. He was standing very still now, like a man trying to calculate something that was not calculable. "No," I said, "that's market rate for a platform keeping 3 hospitals operational." Then I gave them the alternative. They could rebuild from scratch, starting with engineers who understood healthcare compliance standards, real-time data processing requirements, fail-safe architecture, and the very specific difference between software that looks modern in a demo and software that does not fail when a hospital is at capacity at 2 in the morning. 2 years minimum, possibly 3. Assuming they could find the right people, get through compliance certification, and convince their existing clients to wait. Aaron came off the stage and crossed the room toward me, close enough that I could see the damp edge of his collar. "You're going to destroy everything we built," he said. I looked at him without raising my voice. "I built it, Aaron. You just took credit for it." He had no answer for that. Not in front of the cameras, not in front of 87 witnesses, not with Ray Martinez standing 6 feet away holding a document that made every word I had just said legally accurate. I left the hotel through a side exit. My phone started vibrating before I reached the parking garage. Aaron called first, then Victor, then two numbers I did not recognize. I let every call go to voicemail and drove home through normal Tuesday traffic, while behind me an entire boardroom was realizing that the floor had always been mine. When I got home, Lisa was in the kitchen. She took one look at my face and did not ask what had happened. She put the kettle on. I sat down and opened my laptop and found Ray's email waiting. 18 minutes after I had walked out of that hotel, the emergency licensing request was already in my inbox. That was how fast corporate lawyers moved when hospital systems were offline and investors were calling board members directly. I read the document twice. I marked it up. I sent it back. Ray called within the hour. "The board approved your terms," he said. His voice sounded different than it had that morning. Older, somehow, like a few hours had added years. "I'll restore critical functions this afternoon," I told him. "Full service resumes when the first payment clears." A pause. "Greg," he said, "how long have you been planning this?" I looked at the folder on the table in front of me. 5 years of contracts, commit logs, patent records, and time-stamped proof. "Since 2019, I said. "I just had to wait for Aaron to give me the legal reason." Another pause. "He never actually read your contract, did he?" It was not quite a question. "He read the room," I said, and the room told him what he wanted to hear. The first payment cleared on Thursday morning. By noon, the major systems were running again. Admissions were flowing. Pharmacy integrations were processing. Billing was sending claims. Hospital dashboards were green. To anyone walking through those medical centers, nothing had changed. But inside the company, everyone understood exactly what had changed. They were no longer operating on owned technology. They were renting the foundation from the man they had fired on stage. The story broke on Friday. A technology publication led with a headline about a single contract clause that had nearly brought down a healthcare company valued at $40 million. Trade publications followed through the weekend. A few pieces tried to frame me as a disgruntled engineer who had held a company hostage, but the better reporters focused on the part that actually mattered. The clause was real. The signatures were real. The board approval was real. And the firing had happened on camera. By the end of the first week, hospital clients were sending formal inquiries. Who owned the platform? How long did the licensing agreement last? What happened if terms were not renewed? Could they guarantee continuity of service? In healthcare technology, uncertainty is not a temporary problem. It is an existential one. Aaron lasted 11 days after the meeting before being moved into what the company officially called a strategic advisory role. In corporate language, that meant he still had a badge and a paycheck and no meaningful authority over anything that mattered. 2 weeks after the shareholder meeting, Ray called me before sending the audit results to the board. "Greg," he said, "it is worse than they expected." The technical audit showed that more than 80% of the core platform traced directly to code I had written, systems I had designed, or architecture documents with my name in the version history. The remaining portion was interface work, buttons, screens, menus, the visible layer that clients click through. None of it functioned without my backend. Aaron had called my work outdated. The audit called it foundational. That was the difference between a press release and reality. The company's valuation dropped significantly over the following weeks. 3 clients paused expansion plans. 2 opened formal conversations with competing vendors. The board began emergency discussions about acquisition options, none of which were easy when the acquirer would immediately discover the same ownership problem during due diligence. Telnash resigned quietly about a month after the meeting. He sent me a brief message before he left. He said he had not understood the full situation when Aaron brought him in, and he was sorry for the role he had played without realizing it. I wrote back and told him he had nothing to apologize for. He had been used, and knowing the difference between participating in something and being used to enable it was worth more than most lessons his career would teach him. I meant that. The legal process that followed was not quick or simple. Negotiations stretched over several months, involving the board, multiple outside counsel, and eventually a mediator. The final agreement gave the company a permanent license to the platform in exchange for a settlement that I am not at liberty to detail fully, plus my name correctly attributed in all future patent filings related to the systems I had designed. It was not the number that mattered most to me. It was the attribution. 6 years of work with my name finally attached to it, in writing, in legal documents, in filings that would exist long after Aaron's slide decks were deleted from a server somewhere. The night the agreement was signed, Lisa made dinner, and we ate at the kitchen table where I had spent so many evenings sorting through folders of evidence. The coffee was actually warm this time. The house felt quieter in a different way than it had during those months of preparation. Quieter, like the end of something, rather than the holding of breath before something. She asked me if I felt the way I had expected to feel. I thought about it honestly. I feel like I built something real, I said, and now the record says so. She smiled. That's enough, she said. She was right. The strange thing about that shareholder meeting is that Aaron thought he was writing the final chapter of my story. He thought the microphone and the cameras and the room full of witnesses would be the ending. He just had the roles wrong. He thought I was the one being erased. But what was actually happening, while he smiled at his slides and practiced his phrases about future-ready thinking, was that he was walking himself into the only position where Clause 6D could fully activate. I did not plan for him to be cruel. I planned for the possibility that someone might be. Aaron was not a monster. He was something more ordinary and more dangerous, a man who had convinced himself that credit and capability were the same thing. A man who had spent long enough standing in front of other people's work that he had started to believe it was his. That kind of mistake does not need enemies to punish it. It only needs time and a contract that was drafted carefully during a busy restructuring that nobody else thought was worth slowing down for. If you have ever watched someone take credit for your work, smiled politely while it happened, and quietly kept every piece of evidence you would eventually need, then you already understand this story better than most people in that ballroom ever did. Patience is not weakness. Documentation is not paranoia. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room is say nothing at all, because you are already holding everything you need. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Would you have confronted him earlier, or would you have waited and prepared the way Greg did? Have you ever watched someone take credit for your work and known that the right moment had not come yet? Subscribe to Alex's Revenge Justice for more stories about the people who build the foundation, stay quiet when it matters, and let the truth arrive exactly when it is supposed to.